Welcome to the ACEIT podcast, where we turn science into sense. As we begin our 11th season, I wanted to let you know that JCOIN has a new O. That's right. The formerly Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network is now the Justice Community Overdose Innovation Network. Same wonderful network, same awesome podcast, but with a broader emphasis. So I am so excited that you're with us. I'm Danielle Rudes, your host, and this is ACEIT. Welcome to episode 2 of season 11 of the ACEIT podcast. On today's episode of our season on SUD, overdose, and loved ones, we're talking about parents' experiences. That is, people's experiences of parenting while having a substance use disorder or overdose incident, and of being the parent to a child with an SUD overdose incident. Luckily, there are a lot of really smart scholars out there who are researching this topic. Let's dive into that literature. So, first, let's talk about people's experiences of parenting while having an SUD overdose incident. Let's review some important context. From their study of insurance database data from 2016 to 2020, which contained information on over 2 million patients' SUD, medication-assisted treatment, or MOUD, and overdose rates, Gao and colleagues 2023 found that, compared to mothers, fathers have a higher prevalence of SUD and more frequently receive SUD treatment. However, there was no substantial difference in overdose risk between mothers and fathers. This is interesting, especially given research that we will discuss shortly that finds some pretty distinct differences between the experiences of mothers and fathers who have a substance use disorder. All right. So now looking at the experiences of parents with substance use disorders or overdose incidents. First, from the research we have gathered, there are certain child-related factors that might make people less likely to engage in treatment and therefore place them at a higher risk for overdose. Primarily, numerous studies document that childcare responsibilities are a major barrier to receiving treatment. For example, through interviews with 14 parents who have an opioid use disorder, Bacos Block and colleagues 2022 found that parents did not pursue treatment due to needing to look after their children, as well as that care was often too expensive to justify. Additionally, they found that childcare responsibilities appeared to serve as a larger barrier to treatment for mothers than fathers. Interestingly, though, the same study found that most parents, 11 in their study, view their children as a motivating factor for getting treatment. So while parents may really want treatment, having children may prevent them from accessing it. This brings up some important policy implications, like expanding free and affordable childcare. Somewhat similarly, Fetter and colleagues 2018 analyzed data from close to 2 million respondents to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health and found that fear of stigma, access barriers, and not believing that treatment should be a priority are more common among parents with OUD who are living with children than those who are not living with children. Again, this underscores how parents with substance use who live with their children are an especially high-risk population. In a different study, which analyzed the childcare factors, treatment services, and overdose-related outcomes of 575 New York City parents, Scheidel and colleagues 2022 found that difficulty assessing treatment due to childcare responsibilities was associated with approximately 50% higher prevalence of lifetime overdoses. So, not only are parents with SUD less likely to utilize treatment, but this lack of access places them at a higher risk for overdose. Moreover, other research has found that removal of a child from the home increases overdose risk. For instance, Thurmeth and colleagues 2021 analyzed data from a sample of nearly 700 mothers and found that child removal increased the odds of overdose by 55%. Scheidel and colleagues' research that I mentioned earlier also finds that mothers may specifically avoid treatment for fear of contact with child welfare. So mothers may effectively be saddled with an impossible choice. Should they go into treatment and risk having their child removed from their home, which then in turn places them at higher risk for overdose, Or should they not pursue treatment in order to avoid contact with child welfare, which then also places them at higher risk for overdose since they are not receiving treatment? Either way, it's clear that parents, and particularly mothers, who have a substance use disorder are an underserved population. Okay, so now that we've talked about how child-related factors might impact treatment accessibility and overdose, let's talk about how substance misuse impacts people's parenting. Overwhelmingly, the research finds that parents who struggle with substance abuse have more negative parenting styles. For instance, from their systematic review of the literature on the topic, Voss and colleagues 2023 concluded that fathers with opioid use disorder, as opposed to other substance use disorders, have more impairments in parenting. They reference many studies, but focus on one in particular, McMahon and colleagues 2008. In their study, McMahon and colleagues interviewed 50 fathers and found that opioid-dependent fathers, as opposed to other substance use disorders, have more limited economic resources, poorer relationships with their children's mothers, less frequent residence with their child, less positive parenting, and poorer satisfaction in their fathering ability. In a different study, which surveyed 224 fathers with substance use disorder, McMahon 2024 found that fathers with opioid use disorder had more gender role conflict than non-substance use disorder fathers. Specifically, these fathers had more difficulty expressing emotions, especially in the presence of other men. They had more negative attitudes about competition to pursue success, and they had more trouble balancing the demands of work and school against the demands of family life. Mothers with opioid use disorder also appear to face similar struggles. For instance, in their review of the existing literature, Pishish and colleagues 2018 found that mothers with opioid use disorder are less sensitive, warm, and involved, and more harsh and disapproving than mothers without opioid use disorder. Taken together, all this literature suggests that addiction may have negative impacts on parenting. When the other literature on how child-related factors might impact treatment accessibility and overdose are taken into account, it is overwhelmingly clear that parents with substance use disorder should be an especially important target population for treatment providers. Okay, now let's talk about the experience of being the parent to a child with a substance use disorder or overdose incident. First, studies documenting that parenting a child with a substance use disorder can be challenging. For example, Teitelstedt and colleagues' 2022 Mixed Methods Survey and Interview Project found that parents of children who misuse drugs often live in a constant state of preparedness and live their lives fearing for the child's life. Similarly, Figelman and colleagues' 2022 survey of 400 bereaved parents found that parents of children who misuse drugs often anticipate their child's death. Following the overdose-related death of a child, which experts often refer to as drug death bereavement, parents also experience a complex grieving process. Described by scholars as a, quote, emotional overload and a roller coaster, unquote, this grief journey can be full of sadness, triggers, fear, anger, exhaustion, and sometimes hope. In one study, Sterling and colleagues 2022 interviewed 6 parents who had recently lost a child to an overdose. One man's story, Jim's, depicts this journey. He said, quote, "My way to describe to people what my grief is that on the day he died, it was like the world handed me a big stone, and I knew that I would carry that stone every day for the rest of my life. And in the beginning, the weight is incredible because you're not used to carrying it, but you learn to carry it, and the muscles that you need become stronger. And there are people who will help you carry it when you can't, and it becomes a part of you," unquote. For Jim, the initially unbearable loss becomes manageable over time. Many other bereaved parents share this experience. Other studies capture that for some parents, realizing that they did everything possible to sustain their child's life brings them some comfort, though other parents still wonder how they could have done more to prevent their child's death. Additionally, De Silva and colleagues, through interviews with 6 families, found that for some parents, they feel peace, that the cycle of drama accompanying drug addiction is now over. Still others feel anger toward their children, particularly in that they let their substance misuse impact their relationships with their parents and sometimes took advantage of them. Finally, the death of a child may be acutely painful for parents of only children who feel as though they have had to forfeit their parental role, as documented in the study by Titelstadt and colleagues 2021. Still, though, grief and loss can sometimes bring about positive growth. For instance, Titelstadt and colleagues 2022 found that bereaved parents enjoyed a greater compassion toward other people who use drugs. They had an increased realization of self-efficacy and the support networks that they could rely on. To navigate their grief and loss, parents adopt several coping strategies. For instance, Titelstadt and colleagues 2020 interviewed 14 bereaved parents and found that parents try hard to practice intentional mindsets and try to seek information about their child's overdose incident and drug addiction history in order to gain closure and understanding. Parents also shared that they confided in close, trusted friends. A reliance on social support was also documented by Sterling and colleagues 2022. In Sterling and colleagues' study, parents described relying on their parents, typically the other parent of the deceased child, their friends, and official support groups. Second, parents often perceive stigmatization from others after the overdose-related death of their child. Often, this stigmatization comes from close friends or relatives. For instance, in the same study conducted by Sterling and colleagues 2022 that I discussed a moment ago, Paula shared that, quote, "I do feel like silent judgment from people. They think you must be bad parents if you tell people your son died of a drug overdose," unquote. For Paula and other parents, they feel shamed by others. Parents often also experience that people will avoid bringing up the death of the person who died, or sometimes refuse to recognize that addiction is a disease. And with that, we've reached the end of our episode on parents' experiences with substance use disorder and overdose. I hope you learned something today. And if anyone listening is navigating parenting with a substance use disorder or has lost a child to overdose, I hope this episode shows you that you're not alone and that there are resources out there for you. I'll talk to you on the next episode, where we will be discussing children's experiences as being a child with an SUD or overdose incident and of being a child of a parent with an SUD overdose incident. As a reminder, if after listening to this episode you need support, please contact the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Thank you for listening to the ACEDIT podcast. We love hearing from you. So if you have comments, topics to suggest, or some science you'd like us to cover in a future season, please write to me, Danielle Rudes, at Sam Houston State University in Texas. My email is drudes, D-R-U-D-E-S, at shsu.edu. And of course, thank you to the Justice Community Overdose Innovation Network, JCOIN's Coordination and Translation Center, funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, housed at George Mason University, where this podcast originated. Thank you to our fabulous scriptwriter and also my fantastic doctoral student, Bryce Kushmerek-McCune. And a huge and heartfelt thank you to the team at Slonky LLC for their wonderful podcast production, as always. Tune in again for another episode of ACEDIT.